I took the bus to work. I packed my own lunch. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment while my siblings drove matching Audis and called it a family. They removed me from the group chat, excluded me from every meeting, and the night before my father's will was read, one of them looked into that fireplace and said, calmly, like it was simply true, that I had never been worthy of our family name. The next morning, my father's attorney opened a laptop. My father's face appeared on the screen. And the first thing he said, in front of all four of them, was my name. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Jackie Park. I am 34 years old, a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Seattle, Washington, and until 8 days ago, I believed the worst thing my family had ever done to me was make me feel invisible. I was wrong. I wake up at 5:30 every morning without an alarm, old discipline, the kind you develop when nobody is coming to save you. I pack my own lunch. I take the bus. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill with a window that faces east, and every morning the light comes in whether I want it to or not. My father, Raymond Park, built a real estate empire from $40 and a suitcase. By the time I was old enough to understand money, we lived in a colonial house in Bellevue with a circular driveway and a gardener named Pete who always remembered my name even when my own family seemed to forget it. I was the second born and the quietest, the one who got a partial scholarship to the University of Washington and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest while my siblings attended private universities on my father's credit card. He told me it was because I was strong enough to do it alone. I was 22 before I understood that was not a compliment. It was a dismissal dressed in the language of praise. I have 4 siblings, Lorraine, the eldest, beautiful and calculated, the twins, Raymond Jr. and Priscilla, who moved through the world like a closed voting block, and Conrad, the youngest, whose charm was as practiced as a signature. They were a family within the family. I was something adjacent to it. The call came on a Tuesday. I had oatmeal on the stove and a budget report due by 9. My phone buzzed, unknown number, Portland area code. The voice was calm, almost clinical. Raymond Park had passed away Sunday evening. His attorney had been asked to contact me personally. I turned off the stove, sat on my kitchen floor, and watched the microwave clock for 11 minutes without moving. None of my siblings called. Not that morning, not the day before, not once between Sunday evening when my father drew his last breath in a Portland hospital room and Tuesday morning when a stranger delivered the news to my kitchen floor. That silence told me everything I needed to understand about what was coming. I drove down from Seattle in complete quiet, no music, no podcasts, just the sound of tires on wet asphalt and my own breathing, slow and deliberate, the way you breathe when you are preparing yourself for something you cannot yet name. The Bellevue estate appeared through the trees the way it always had, grand and indifferent, like a building that had never needed to earn your affection. 3 cars were already in the circular driveway when I arrived. Lorraine's white Range Rover. The twins' matching black Audis. Conrad's Tesla. They had all arrived before me despite living farther away, and the precision of that felt intentional, like a seating arrangement designed to remind me where I stood. The house smelled like cedar and old money, the same way it always had, but the energy inside was tighter, coiled. Lorraine stood in the foyer with her arms crossed, wearing black that fit too well to have been chosen in grief. She had planned that outfit. I was certain of it. The twins sat on the staircase whispering, and Conrad leaned in the parlor doorway scrolling his phone as though my arrival was a minor inconvenience in an otherwise scheduled day. 8 years earlier, at a Christmas dinner I still think about, our Aunt Ruth had repeated something my father once told her privately, that of all his children, Jackie had his sharpest mind. She said it over her second glass of Riesling, loose and warm, meaning it as a gift. Lorraine had received it as a wound. I watched her face that night go very still in a way I did not fully understand until much later. She never forgot. In the Park family, intellect outranked everything, and she had just been publicly outranked. "You actually came," she said when I walked through the door. Not warmly. I held her gaze. He was my father too, I replied. She tilted her head and smiled with only her mouth. Gerald Holt arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon, a lean man in his 60s with silver hair and a leather briefcase that looked like it had absorbed 30 years of other people's secrets. He shook each of our hands with the practiced composure of a man who had delivered difficult news enough times to have developed a face for it. He told us the reading would happen the following morning, per Raymond's specific instructions, and then he left us alone in the house together, which I suspect my father had also planned. That night the 5 of us sat around the formal dining room table for the first time in 3 years. Someone had ordered catering, salmon and roasted potatoes that sat on expensive platters and went almost entirely untouched. Lorraine opened the conversation the way she opened everything, like a chairperson calling a meeting to order. She talked about the Portland properties, the Seattle commercial units, the Scottsdale vacation home, the investment portfolios, and then she used the word consolidated in a way that made my jaw tighten. She said the estate should be managed by those who were most involved, and Priscilla nodded slowly, and Conrad leaned back in his chair, and I set down my fork and asked what involved meant exactly. What I did not say at that table, what none of them knew, was that 3 years prior, Lorraine had quietly had me removed from the family's group communications, citing a vague need to simplify. My father never pushed back. He was not a man who liked confrontation. So I had missed birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, and what I later learned were informal family business meetings where Lorraine had been steadily repositioning herself as the estate's de facto manager. She had planted her flag while I was working 60-hour weeks in Seattle, and I had not known the ground was moving beneath me until I was already standing on entirely different terrain. "Don't make this difficult," Conrad said. I looked at him across the table. "I asked a question," I replied. Nobody answered it. I could not sleep. Sometime past 11 I came downstairs for water, barefoot on the cold marble, and I heard them before I saw them. The parlor fire was going, drinks were poured, and all 4 of them were arranged around the room in the particular comfort of people who believe they are completely alone. I stopped on the stairs. I did not announce myself. I am still not certain whether that decision was instinct or something colder. Lorraine's voice carried the way it always did, shaped by a lifetime of assuming rooms belonged to her. She said I hadn't been a park in any meaningful way for years. Conrad said I was honestly embarrassing, that I took the bus, that I worked some mid-level analyst job, that our father had built an empire and I was doing spreadsheets for a firm nobody had heard of. Priscilla suggested I should take something symbolic, something small, and step aside gracefully, as though inheritance were a conversation I was interrupting rather than a legal document with my name already on it. Then Raymond Jr., the quieter twin, the one who always chose his words like he was reading from a prepared statement, said it plainly: "She is not worthy of this family name." She never was. 4 heads nodded. 4 glasses rose. I stood on that staircase in the dark with the fire casting their shadows long across the floor, and I felt something I had not expected, not rage, not tears, but a deep, clarifying calm, the kind that comes when every suspicion you have spent years talking yourself out of is finally confirmed out loud. I went back upstairs without the water. I sat on the edge of the bed in my childhood room, the one with the smaller window, the one they had always given me without discussion, as though even square footage was a statement. And I made a quiet decision in that room, whatever that will contained, would not apologize for my own name. I would not make it easier for any of them. I would simply wait until morning. Gerald opened his briefcase at 9 o'clock sharp, and the study felt smaller than I remembered it, compressed by the weight of 5 people who each believed the room owed them something different. Lorraine had positioned herself closest to the desk. The twins flanked her like punctuation. Conrad sat apart, one leg crossed, performing ease. I sat at the back near the window, where the light came in pale and overcast and fell across everything without favoring anyone. Gerald said that before the reading, my father had requested a personal video message be played. He opened a laptop on the desk, and then my father's face appeared on the screen, older than the last time I had seen him, thinner, but his eyes were unchanged, still sharp and slightly guarded, the eyes of a man who had spent his whole life calculating distance. He sat in this very chair, in this very room, and he looked directly into the camera as though he had practiced until the discomfort left his face. He said if we were watching this, he was gone, and Gerald was doing his job. He said he wanted to speak before the numbers got in the way. He paused for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he said my name. Jackie. One word, and the room went absolutely still. For years earlier, when his longtime accountant had retired, my father had called me on a Wednesday evening, unprompted, and asked if I could help him digitize and organize 30 years of financial records. I had driven to Bellevue every other weekend for 8 months. We sat together in this study drinking bad coffee from a machine he never learned to operate correctly, sorting folders, talking, not about money but about everything surrounding it, the decisions and the silences and the years that had passed between us like rooms neither of us knew how to enter. It was the closest we had ever been. I never told my siblings. He looked into the camera and said he owed me an apology he had never given out loud. I did not move. I did not look away from the screen. The video ran for 6 more minutes, and my father spoke the way I had only heard him speak once before, in that study, over bad coffee, on a Saturday afternoon when he thought he was simply talking and I did not yet understand I was being trusted. He described the 8 months I had spent helping him organize his records. He described what he found inside them. Over 4 years, Lorraine had made a series of transfers from a family holding account, small amounts at first, incremental and patient, then larger ones as her confidence grew. She had moved $340,000 into a personal LLC she had formed in Nevada without the family's knowledge, without authorization, without a single conversation. She had formed the LLC 3 years ago, just weeks after the Christmas dinner where Aunt Ruth had delivered my father's words about my mind like an accidental grenade. Lorraine had told herself it was protection, a financial cushion in case Raymond changed course. She had used estate funds as seed capital. The accountant who helped her establish it had died of a heart attack 2 years later, which she had privately considered a convenience. She had not considered that the man she was protecting herself against would spend 8 months sitting with his quietest daughter, methodically examining every wire transfer log in 30 years of financial history. My father said he had confronted her privately. She had cried. He had forgiven her in the way that people forgive things they cannot undo, quietly, without resolution. But he had not forgotten, and he had not changed his plans. I did not look at Lorraine while the video played. But I felt her beside me the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, the room contracting slightly, the silence around her becoming a different quality of silence. When I finally turned, her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness so deliberate it looked like something she was physically holding in place. Her face was not guilt. It was not quite fear. It was the expression of someone watching a demolition they were certain they had prevented. Gerald closed the laptop with a soft, final click, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that house. Then he opened the sealed document, smoothed it against the desk with both hands, and began. He read the standard provisions first: estate acknowledgments, outstanding obligations, the charitable foundations my father had supported for years without ever mentioning them at dinner. The Scottsdale vacation home went to the twins and Conrad jointly, with a clause requiring unanimous agreement before any sale could proceed. The twins looked at each other. Conrad exhaled through his nose. They had expected liquidity. They had expected something they could move quickly, the way people do when they have already decided what the money is for. The Portland commercial properties transferred into a newly formed family trust administered by Gerald's firm for no fewer than 10 years before any liquidation could be considered. Lorraine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had spent 3 years building toward a moment of control, and the document was systematically closing every door she had mapped. Gerald paused. It was a professional pause, the kind refined by decades of practice, long enough to signal that what followed required a different quality of attention. The Seattle commercial units, he said. 7 properties. Current combined appraised value of $4.3 million. I had spent 10 years as a financial analyst in Seattle. I knew that market the way some people know the layout of a house they grew up in, intuitively, spatially, by feel. I had walked past 3 of those buildings without knowing they were ours. Gerald read the bequest in full. Directly and solely to Jacqueline Park. The room did not explode. That is the thing about real moments, they do not perform themselves. Conrad went very still. Priscilla made a sound she immediately swallowed. Raymond Jr. looked at his hands. And Lorraine sat with her back perfectly straight, her face rearranging itself through several expressions before settling on something I had never seen her wear before, the particular look of a person confronting a loss they believed they had already prevented. It came apart slowly, the way things do when the people involved are too composed to allow themselves the release of falling apart quickly. Gerald continued reading, smaller provisions, personal items, a vintage watch to Conrad, my mother's pearls to Priscilla, a first edition my father had loved to Raymond Jr., and the room absorbed each detail in a silence that had changed its texture entirely. When Gerald finally closed the document, Lorraine rose from her chair with the controlled momentum of someone who has rehearsed standing up under pressure. She said the will was not legal. She said my father had been ill, had not been competent, that the document could not reflect his genuine intentions. Gerald did not raise his voice. He said Raymond had been of sound mind when the document was executed 14 months ago, that it had been witnessed by 3 independent parties and notarized, and that he would strongly advise against pursuing that argument. Conrad started to say something about the transfers, about context, about the video not telling the full story, and Gerald said that matter had been referred to a separate legal process and he was not at liberty to discuss it further. Then the room ran out of moves. Lorraine turned to me. And this is the part one return to, the image that comes back when I am trying to sleep. She did not look at me with anger. She looked at me the way a chess player looks at a piece they spent the entire game ignoring, suddenly and too late understanding what it was. You knew, she said. Her voice was quiet. Almost private. Almost something that could have been a beginning, in a different version of this family. I knew he was watching, I told her. I just didn't know what he saw. She held my gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked across the marble foyer, her heels deliberate and unhurried, refusing to be diminished by speed. The chandelier above us burned fully in the daylight, casting light on everything, leaving nothing in shadow. I stood and watched her go, and I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I felt, instead, something very close to stillness. They left one by one, and each departure had its own character. The twins together, efficient and silent, their matching cars reversing out of the driveway in near unison. Conrad without a word, without eye contact, his Tesla pulling away with the quiet hum of something trying not to draw attention to itself. Lorraine last, and slowly, each step across the marble a small act of refusing to be rushed. I stood in the foyer until the sound of the last engine faded into the neighborhood, and then I was alone in my father's house for the first time in my life. Gerald had left me copies of all documents and a plain brass ring holding 7 keys, one for each Seattle property. I carried them into the study and sat behind my father's desk, the chair still angled the way he left it, and I set the keys on the mahogany surface in front of me. They were heavier than I expected. Not physically. Weighted in the way that objects become weighted when they represent the accumulated pressure of everything it took to arrive at a single moment. Inside one of the file folders, a folder I had personally helped organize on a rainy Saturday 14 months ago, I found a handwritten note on the inside cover. His angular print, slightly unsteady, the way his hands had become in that last year. Jackie, it said. You showed up when I didn't ask you to. That's the only thing that ever mattered. Dad. He had quietly called Gerald the week after I finished the last of the file reorganization. He had said, without drama or ceremony, that he needed to fix something he had been getting wrong for 30 years. He had requested the video specifically so the truth would be spoken in front of all of them, so it could not be privately revised or quietly buried. He had wanted it public. In the end, he had given me the only thing I had never thought to ask him for. I sat in his chair until the light through the tall windows turned amber, and I held those keys, and I let the room be quiet around me. I drove back to Seattle that night and made it home by 10. I did not sleep much, but it was not grief keeping me awake, it was something more complex and harder to name, something suspended between grief and gratitude and the particular vertigo of having your entire sense of yourself rearranged inside a single afternoon. At 5:30, old habit lifted me out of bed. I made oatmeal. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the city come alive below me, the early buses pulling from their stops, the delivery trucks idling on the corner, the lights clicking on in the building across the street one window at a time, each one someone beginning their morning without knowing how much had changed in mine. 7 properties. $4.3 million in Seattle commercial real estate, in a market I had spent 10 years studying professionally, analytically, from the outside. I was not going to sell a single one. I was going to manage them, grow them, build on the foundation my father had spent his life constructing, not to prove anything to my siblings, not to answer the voices I had heard from that dark staircase, but because I finally understood that I had always been the one he was building toward. He had simply not told me until he could no longer speak. 2 weeks after the reading, Gerald called to inform me that Lorraine had been formally served in connection with the unauthorized transfers. The legal process would take time. It always does. Conrad sent a text 3 days later. It said only, "We need to talk." I left it on read. And somewhere in that study in Bellevue, in a drawer I had helped organize on a rainy Saturday that felt unremarkable at the time, there were 4 sealed letters with 4 names written on them in my father's angular print. I had seen them. I had not opened them. What he had written to each of them, what he had seen, what he still owed them, what he could not say on camera, was a question I had not yet decided what to do with. But I knew those letters were waiting. And I knew that when the time came, whatever was inside them would change everything again.